Hello and welcome back to Non-Compete. I'm American Johnson. Today we have a special guest. This is Alana, who actually coined the term incel. I believe it was originally incel with a V, but this was way back in the 90s. And Alana, thank you so much for joining us. And how are you doing? I guess this evening for you. How are you?
Thank you for having me on. I'm doing pretty well this evening. We're having a lovely warm weather here, so I'm just enjoying that. But I hear you want to hear about stuff that happened 20 years ago.
If that sounds like a good beginning, I think that's probably where this all kind of started for you in terms of getting involved with this. Is that not correct?
Yeah. There's various different reports of the date, but it was 1997 when I started a website called Involuntary Celibacy. And as far as I know, I was the first person to use the term, but, I don't really care about that. It was a very friendly, supportive community that we created way back when. Things have changed, but 1997 was a different time.
It really was. I mean, the internet was a totally different place. I was in, I think, middle school at that 1997, and it really was a different place. And in a lot of ways, it was a smaller place, because I just remember when I was on the internet, it wasn't really like a mainstream thing in those days. It was just becoming mainstream, I guess you'd say. But most of the people that I was interacting with in chat rooms, and this was not, there was no Facebook, there was no Twitter. Most of the people I was interacting with were kind of on the nerdier side. They tended to be a lot of people were less socially adjusted. So I'm wondering how that might have affected the nature of the community you were in at that point.
Oh yeah, the internet culture that I came from was academic and community oriented. I started using the internet as an undergrad in about 1992. So that was back when only academics had accounts. And then it became available through community networks where I was volunteering, and eventually the World Wide Web technology started to develop. And so the website I created was a very early website. I was using fairly new tech. It was text only, in fact. And so I was hand coding HTML to create this black and white plain text website. And it was really exciting to have these hyperlinks going all over the internet. And people would create little awards for a website they liked, and so I had some award things posted on the bottom of my site. So it was a very friendly kind of place to be. And yes, it was full of people who were kind of nerdy and kind of geeky because it started out as an academic thing. And the internet was really only interesting to you if you were good at writing and reading, because it was a text-only place. It wasn't full of advertising. In fact, there was no advertising. There was no shopping. There was no spam, or very little of it. So it was just a completely different place. But it was an excellent place to create a support group, which is what I did. And it was one of the early support groups that were created on the internet. And it was a great place to reach an international audience of people who wanted to talk about a problem they had in common.
You're really taking me back there. Yeah, I remember those little awards. I do remember that very well. In the web rings, and it was a really different environment. So what was the community like when you first started it, and what was the atmosphere like in those days?
So what I did was not only a website, but I set up a mailing list, and a technology that's still working today. And that was the community that we had. And that community was, it was a bunch of people who were kind of shy about talking about themselves because this was a new thing, but they had a new place and a safe space full of strangers to talk about it. People wrote in full sentences with full paragraphs. Everybody was respectful to each other. There were a few friendships built. There was even a man and a woman who met through this mailing list and got married. They're still together. Yeah, it's amazing. It was a totally different thing than the incel community that we see today. So, in fact, this Love Not Anger project that I'm doing now is a little bit. I'm thinking back to those old days 20 years ago when people were friendly on the internet, and maybe I'm fantasizing a little bit. My first thought with the Love Not Anger project was to create a new support forum online, but I quickly realized that would need to be moderated. and that the moderator would need to be paid because we would need someone with mental health qualifications, like a qualified counselor or therapist. So the project is redirected a little bit. At this stage, I'm trying to get research going, because even if you have some counseling, it's not really clear what kind of support and help is needed. What would be the best advice to someone who is lonely and wishing they were dating but having difficulty with that? So there's a lot of development work to be done before just launching an internet forum. And so I don't think the new thing's going to look like the old thing, but the spirit of an open, friendly, and supportive internet is still there.
Going back to the late 90s, a funny thing about that, I guess, is that in around 1997, 1998, that's when I was going through my sort of incel phase that I went through, where I felt like I was, very lonely. I had never had a girlfriend at that time, and I thought, it was never going to happen for me. I was a teenager, I was a kid, basically. But if I would have found that community at that time, and there's a good chance I could have, since I was pretty active on the internet at that time. But what I've been thinking about before I talked to you, before I discovered you, my thoughts about the incel community that exists today have been like, there, but for the grace of God go I. Because if I were a teenager today, I would definitely have been pulled into this newer iteration of the incel community. So this is all kind of hitting pretty close to home for me personally. And I'm wondering, how did your journey with this concept of involuntary celibacy and loneliness, what was going on in your life in the late 90s that first kind of spurred you to create this community?
So some of that is kind of lost in the mists of time, but the outline is that I'd started dating and in my mid-20s, and it had taken me a long time to get there. I was kind of a late bloomer. And when I started dating, I realized that, hey, I'm not the only late bloomer out there. There's other people who have been lonely, who have not really been sure how to approach dating. Maybe they'd been rejected or dating wasn't going well. There are a lot of people who would have been called lonely virgins, or, who would be criticized and maligned and made fun of for being long-term singles. So I identified with all those folks, and identified in the sense of understanding and empathizing, because I had been going through a similar thing. And so I had also heard from a few people who they approached me in awkward ways that would now be considered very inappropriate. But there were a couple of guys who approached me, and one of them wanted to talk about his lack of dating life, and another one had a question about sex. And I understood where they were coming from, even though they were scary and inappropriate and perhaps harassing. They were real people who were having difficulty figuring out how to go about dating, and they were shy around women. And, they talked to me because I guess I stuck my neck out there. I was on the internet, or I was, hanging around in a place where they could find me. And so they just randomly talked to me. And so I learned a bit from guys who were not behaving well, but were human beings who needed a bit of support.
Do you think that there was a link perhaps between the inappropriate behavior that they were exhibiting and the problems they were having, finding romance? I mean, it sounds like that there must be some kind of relationship there. Or did you feel that way at the time?
I didn't feel that way. I don't know what particularly their problems were that kept them from finding love when other guys were doing okay at it. I think it was just a matter of their inappropriateness was more men not knowing how to behave in safe and respectful ways with women. This is just like a standard issue, a problem in our society, at least in North America, that men are somehow learning some behaviors that are creeping women out. And just asking a direct question in our society can be quite offensive depending on what the direct question is. And one of the things that happens is people don't know where to go for support, so they randomly reach out to someone who's available and who's open and visible, and that might not be the most appropriate person to reach out to.
Yeah, I mean, just in general, something I've been thinking about for a while now is that, just people in general, and perhaps men especially, but people in general probably need more social and psychological training, I would think. Because when I think about, especially when I was a teenager, if we just had a little bit more access to, I guess, mental health care or social leadership, I guess you'd say, then some of these problems might be easier to solve. Yeah, but in the world that we are in, I think these kinds of communities, for better or for worse, are sort of substituting for that kind of professional or responsible leadership. So, which brings me back to your community. So, I believe you left in the early 2000s, the original iteration of the incel community you created. Is that correct?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I kind of faded away. I stopped paying attention to the mailing list. It was running itself, and I didn't want to think about it.
Yeah, and you basically gave the website away.
Yeah, well, it wasn't the website, but I transferred the leadership to someone else who created a new website, because it was time for an update. There was, the internet culture had changed, and my website was this old-fashioned old text thing, and so it just gradually died away. It faded into the internet. I lost the password.
Yeah, there's a lot of things that I've lost from those days that. Like you said, in the mists of time, so it is like a different world now when you think back to that iteration of the internet. Did you just not think about it for a few years? Basically, did it just kind of it was not a part of your life for a while?
Yeah, I didn't want to think about it, and through the 2000s, I was dating people, and I didn't want to think about my lonely past, didn't want to talk about it, and I wasn't really thinking about what happened to the involuntary celibacy concept for quite a while. I had my mind on other things. So it wasn't a big deal for me.
And so when and how did you rediscover the fact that this community sort of took a life of its own?
Well, I'm not sure. So I know that it was in 2015 that I found out that the manosphere and the men's rights movement incel had become part of that. And I was pretty shocked, because when I was organizing it, incel was a thing that could be women or men, or actually non-binary people hadn't even identified themselves yet, but it could be anybody. And it was pretty shocking to see that it had become one gender and a hateful version of it. And I didn't really find out about all that until after the Elliot Rodger murder in 2014. And so it was a shock. I knew that the men's rights movement had morphed into this online hate thing. And in retrospect, it looks very connected to the alt-right racist kind of movement. Because if you hate one group, you might as well hate another group. It seems to be the same kind of mentality. And the online hate and racism and sexism got really bad when Barack Obama and Hillary Clinton were running for president. So, 2007-ish. Because, everybody had, a woman to hate and a black man to hate. And guess what? There was a lot of hate going on in the United States and in any culture that's associated with it. So, hatred towards women it's always been there. But it became an online thing that was, even had more jargon of its own. And now it has all these sub-communities of red pillars and men going their own way, and I don't know what. They'll invent another sub-community tomorrow, I'm sure.
It's amazing to me how complex they've made this sort of pseudoscientific philosophy that they have. I mean, because I've taken a really deep dive into it lately for some other projects I'm working on, and it's really so complex that sometimes it's got this whole internal logic that doesn't really make any sense in the real world. But when you get really deep into it, it's I don't know if you've ever listened to Coast to Coast AM, which is this old talk radio program, but they talk about aliens and things like that. And I remember when I was, driving down the road at 2 a.m. listening to this radio program, I'd start to be like, oh yeah, aliens are real. And sometimes when you're so deep into this manosphere, green ink pseudoscience, you start to be like, oh, there is sort of this internal logic that almost makes sense. And I can really see how men, especially younger men who have less experience, interacting with other people, get drawn into it. So it's a little bit terrifying to me just how deeply it goes.
Well, on the one hand, I commend you for spending the emotional effort to go and read all that crap, because I refuse. But
That's probably a wise decision.
yeah, but on the other hand, I also see where you're coming from about how easy it is to adopt any philosophy that has its own internal logic. So it's, religions are like that. Political philosophies are like that.
Exactly.
And young people often adopt a system of philosophy. It's like getting a whole system of rules given to you. And, if you're lucky, you'll just adopt like a role-playing game system of rules. Because, there's a whole
Exactly.
universe to live within. Or maybe you'll read a whole series of books that have their own internal system. Or maybe you'll adopt a religion like Buddhism. Or maybe you'll adopt the manosphere and its internal logic. So I do find it really disturbing how deeply the incel community has gone into men's appearances, worrying about the size of their wrist or, I don't know, the length of their nose or whatever. And, most people who are lonely and not dating probably have some other reason for it besides any particular body part. I know that there are people whose appearance might make it really difficult to date, but from what I'm seeing, that's a minority of the people in incel communities. Like when you see a picture of one of these, people who get famous for unfortunate reasons, they look fine. If they had a nice personality and were charismatic, they'd have lots of dates. So it's
and that takes me back to my personal experience, because when I think back to myself as a teenager and I look at pictures of myself as a teenager, I wasn't a bad looking guy, but I had convinced myself for whatever reason that I was just this ugly, undateable, monster kind of guy. So I can definitely empathize with these young guys, especially that are.
And for women, I think it's rather like women's experience of believing that they're ugly. And, I can't count the number of women who I've talked to who are stunningly beautiful, and yet they perceive themselves as not attractive because they have one tiny little flaw based on what they read in a magazine or based on what their aunt told them or whatever. And so, the guys who are obsessing about their wrist size are doing the same as women who are obsessing about their nose size. It's this obsession about appearance that's somehow displacing concern for your real emotional needs. So it's very sad.
Yeah, I've had a couple of women I've talked to about this tell me that, those issues just reminded them so much of their teenage experiences and constantly looking at themselves in the mirror and constantly worrying about their appearances. So it is kind of interesting. And I'm wondering if, I guess there's no way to know, I guess, but, it's to me, it seems like maybe this isn't new. Maybe this whole idea of men also worrying about their appearance isn't new, but it's just that somehow maybe it's the internet that has allowed men to start talking about it and sharing their experiences a little bit more. Because maybe in the past it wasn't so easy to find. Because again, it goes back to community. Maybe these communities are allowing men to share these insecurities that maybe 50 years ago it would have been kept hidden. I don't know. That's just something I've thought about.
That's a great point, actually, because I keep thinking about how part of the problem is that men are taught not to share their vulnerabilities. Like, if you're feeling vulnerable about being single, maybe you're taught not to talk to your friend in person about it. So they're going online to talk to strangers where it's safer to be vulnerable. And they're finding a bunch of strangers who are giving them, like, really wrong-headed ideas about women and objectification of women and so on. So maybe we should say not just, do be vulnerable and do share your feelings, but, try and share them with people who respect others. I think that might be a concern here.
And people who have, a healthy way of, who can show you a healthy way of dealing with the pain that you might be having, I think is very important. Which brings us to, I think, your new project, Love Not Anger. That's sort of, isn't that sort of the thesis of your project?
Absolutely. Love, not anger, is fundamentally the point. How can lonely people find respectful love instead of being stuck in anger? And so I'm concerned about not just men who are in the incel communities. That's like a very small subset of the people out there in this world who are feeling lonely, having trouble dating. It could be men, women, non-binary people, it's everybody. And there's a lot of different reasons why it can happen to somebody. You know, people do talk about anxiety and autism. Those are some of the reasons, but there can be other reasons. And so I think what's needed is to do more research for people who are in that situation to find out what are the reasons people end up lonely. Are they having trouble learning social skills? One of my big theories is that there's a lot of people who are having trouble learning social skills. They're not learning much in school or from their peers or from their parents. Maybe they're not learning healthy and respectful ways to make friends and start relationships. And maybe they are expected to pick up social skills in kind of an unspoken way, because a lot of those rules are unwritten. And especially if you have autism symptoms, it's very difficult to learn social rules without seeing some explicit rules. So making some healthy approaches to dating and relationships explicit and obvious and clear to people might be helpful. But this project of Love Not Anger is about doing research to confirm some theories like that and to figure out what kind of supports would be useful to people. Because, you know, people are making a stab in the dark and creating, you know, dating advice websites based on their own charisma and a little bit of experience and some common sense advice. Like, for example, Dr. Nerdlove is doing that. And it's kind of cool, but I'm not sure there's like some evidence, science, psychology, research behind all that kind of advice. So, you know, I don't yet know what would be best advice to give to a person who's having dating difficulties. I'm pretty sure that the incel community is probably the worst place to go. And I can have some guesses about where would be better places to go. But I don't think we really know yet there's no easy answer, there's no quick answer. And I don't think we're really sure what the slow answers are.
How would you define the problem that your organization is researching and trying to combat?
So the tagline, the mission is to research how lonely people might find respectful love and not be stuck in anger. So it's about lonely people of all genders, all orientations, and it's about people who want to have love and intimacy in their lives. It's not just about sex. It's not about appearances. It's about wanting human connection with someone who feels good with you. And that, you know, that's what a love relationship is about. And it's about offering support to people who don't yet have experience of that kind of love. They might not have grown up with it. They might be young and still struggling to find it. They might have struggled for a long time or given up struggling. And, you know, this is not a happy situation to be in, but it doesn't have to be an angry situation. It can be a situation where you have a little bit of hope for gradually building some human connections. You know, it might be that people have to start with friendship before they get anywhere near finding love relationships. But just finding that human connection to others, being able to empathize with other people and see everyone around them as a human worthy of respect. And to understand those other people and their feelings, I think is a good first step for anybody who is struggling with this situation.
Yeah, and it's kind of amazing to me that it's taken so long for society to really, I guess, pick up on this problem in the way that it has, because it's such an important part of the human experience, you know, and it's such an important part of our pop culture and our media and our literature. And yet it seems like it's only been in the last decade or so that this kind of public discussion has started to occur about what it really means to be lonely, what it really means to have these issues.
Yeah, and I'm sure that there has been discussion of this in previous decades, but maybe in a more dismissive or pejorative way. You know, the movie about the 40-year-old virgin. So it's always been known in our culture. But to actually get it on the table as something where society needs to make some changes, sometimes it takes a major disaster or murders or really awful things have to happen before society pays attention. So I'm taking this as an opportunity to move the yardsticks forward, to make a difference on an issue that is now of actual concern to society. People didn't care about it 20 years ago. It didn't make news.
And I'm sure that leads to a lot of the feelings of alienation that a lot of these people are having today. And something else that you touched on it a little bit, and going back to the idea of gender, there's this myth within the incel community that this is a problem that is specifically a male problem. And that men, are kind of like unfairly put in this position where, like women could be, like they have this myth that a woman can pick, any guy she wants, and that a guy basically has, unless you're one of the top, whatever, they have a specific percentage even of like what percentage of men can have a successful relationship, whatever. It's all pseudoscience, but that's a big myth, and it's important to dispel. And something that another feminist I was talking to mentioned was that there has been this concept of sort of inceldom for women for a very long time, because we even have words like spinster and old maid that are used to describe a woman who doesn't have a relationship in older age, whereas the words we have to describe men who are not, married would be bachelor, and that is sort of almost a positive word, or it evokes this idea of like a playboy or somebody who's, going out and dating a lot of women. So, I mean, how do you see gender kind of interfacing with this problem?
You just gave a great example of how sometimes the same concept, when it's applied to women, is a negative, and applied to men it becomes a positive, when you talked about spinsters and old maids. So gender just makes this harder to unpack. And there's a lot of little reasons why. And, one of them is that when women are usually better at learning social skills and emotional stuff than men, so a woman who's not learning them isn't going to get much support, because as a female person, she's expected to learn social skills easily, innately. Women with autism often go undiagnosed, and they struggle with social skills, but in different ways than men. So that's one issue, that like however we approach learning social skills and dating skills will be different for women and for men. Another gender issue that I'm seeing a lot is tremendous media attention to the hateful and dangerous incel men, and no media interest in the women who are single and lonely and having trouble with dating, because they're not dangerous. So it's as if the incel guys are succeeding in getting attention to their problem by being hateful and occasionally murderous, which is exactly what they want. That's what that's why they are being violent. Whereas women are, brought up not to be violent, and instead to turn anger in upon themselves, and to live with their own sadness, to become depressed, to have an eating disorder, to do self-harm behaviors. Those are typical reactions of a woman to serious stress in their lives. Whereas a man might be more encouraged to act out. He can get away with being angry and demonstrating that anger. And so all the various forms of violence against women are connected to this incel phenomenon. And, sometimes men are violent against the woman they marry. Sometimes it's the woman who refused to marry them, or who left. And sometimes it's the woman they couldn't have at all. And sometimes it's all the women, because they can't find a woman who will have them. But it's the same trend of a man being violent against one or more women because he feels they've wronged him, and he feels entitled to be with them.
It's really the myth that men only have these problems, and it's really central to their whole belief structure. And I think if we could dismantle that belief, all the rest of it kind of falls apart, I think, because that's a major kind of keystone to it. But the myth is so built in. I mean, I think it's really deeply woven into some of the ancillary communities that incels tend to come from, because going back to the 90s internet, where, we're both have experience, there was a joke going around back then that was really, prevalent, that there are no women on the internet. and that was just like this sort of a joke. I think it's even one of those rules of the internet that like if somebody says she's a woman, she's lying. There's no women on the internet. That's an old kind of nerd.
Oh, thanks for reminding me. Right, because the internet began as a domain of academics in male-dominated disciplines like computer science. I studied math, and I was one of the only women in that department. There are very few. So there was a trend of men pretending to be women on the internet for whatever reason. Now there are women on the internet. Hey, that's great. But let's address that question of the incel community's philosophy that women cannot be incel, which is, it's laughable and it's not true. There are lots of women who have difficulty with dating. Maybe not as many as men, but there's still lots. So but the underpinning of the attitude is that women are sexual objects. So if an incel guy is talking on one of these forums, often he's talking about, rating all the women, from 1 to 10 in their score of what their appearance is like. And so he's completely objectifying a woman as a beautiful object, and her brain is not of interest, and probably she doesn't have a brain. So if you believe that, then you might also believe that any woman can go out and just say to a guy, hey, want to have sex? And instantly be accepted if they have the right appearance scores, and their appearance scores are close enough. And so then that somehow leads to the idea that any woman, because she can just ask for sex and get it from all the desperate guys, then it's impossible for a woman to be incel, for her to be celibate, because she can get any sex she wants. Now, this is not true. There are times when men refuse sex, and men have just as much right to refuse sex as women do. And women are trained not to go and ask for sex. I mean, the chances of a woman actually going up to a guy and asking for sex are really low. And that's because it's dangerous. So, all these guys are completely out to lunch about how a woman's life might work. And they're out to lunch about, why would they want to be with a woman anyway? And does a woman have a brain? It's all pretty ridiculous, actually. So, there's some... Sorry, I'm ranting a bit here.
Oh, no, I mean, it's a little frustrating to me, especially because there are other communities that I've been in contact with. I'm not a part of them, but I've been, communicating with these communities and watching these communities for a long time, including the trans community, the disabled community, and the queer community, and the LGBTQ. They have a lot of these same issues in terms of having difficulty finding romance, having difficulty finding people that are interested in them. And it's probably a lot deeper difficulty than, for instance, I had when I was a, goofy kid that, couldn't find a girlfriend. I mean, that was a much less severe problem, I would think, than some of the people in these other communities face. So why do you think, why do you think that there's less toxicity in those other forms of inceldom or whatever you want to call it?
Okay, so I of course there would be less toxicity amongst marginalized people because they're out there supporting each other. So you talked about people with disabilities and trans people, both, like, I'm, pretty connected to both those communities. And yes, by the way, when we're talking, I think our audience might not know that both of us have white skin, and in both of us have a fair amount of privilege, like, relatively able-bodied, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely.
Right. So let's just clarify that this is not, like, I don't want to be us and them about it.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So so a lot of the things I said earlier about men actually apply to men who are relatively privileged, who, have a conventionally attractive appearance, and women who are conventionally attractive to a reasonable degree. So when you think about people with disabilities, there's like millions of visible and invisible kinds of disabilities out there, but all of them make a person less attractive on the sexual market. And it's really ugly, but it's true. I have a friend who is very pretty, and when she was walking with a cane temporarily, all the catcalls stopped. The men left her alone because she suddenly went off their radar as a sexually, interesting person. So that really, and she didn't stop being pretty. So that was, a great lesson in how having a disability does actually make it harder to date other people because fewer people are interested in you. It's still possible. I know lots of disabled people who are dating somebody who are reasonably calm about it and are comfortable with dating. But I've certainly met disabled people who are struggling with it. And I think whenever you are part of some marginalized group or you have a minority preference, there is a real challenge because there are fewer people who will be interested in dating you. You might have to be in a larger city to find people who are interested. You might have to cast the net broader. You might have to, your personality becomes a much more important part of your attractiveness. It's still entirely plausible. I know lots of people with disabilities who are dating. I know lots of trans people who are in happy relationships. And people in all sorts of other marginalized groups, but it would be harder to find someone to date. And if whatever has led you to be marginalized there might be other impacts on you socially. Might have been harder to learn social skills. You might have more anxiety or more depression or more trauma to deal with. And so it's definitely harder to date if you're a marginalized or oppressed person, but it's not impossible.
Yeah. And I was just... the main reason for me to bring that up was just that I think that the fact that this male-dominated incel community, they find it so difficult to believe that there are non-males who would have trouble, with these same issues. And it's just kind of frustrating to me because it's like, if you just pay a little bit of attention to some other communities, to some people that don't look and sound exactly like you might find that, there are other people. It's a bigger problem than just like this specifically male problem. And I think some of the stuff that they talk about, you were talking about their the way that they rate women's looks and the way that they are like measuring people's, because I've seen where they like measure people's jaws, they're measuring people's foreheads, and it's so dark to me because it really, to me, it reminds me of the eugenics movements of like the 30s and 40s when you would have, like the Nazis like trying to put people into different ethnic categories and trying to find out which lives are worth living, and it's like. And the fact that they're calling it the black pill and that they're saying like this is a lifelong condition that you're going to have and you can't escape from it. It's just, there's so much darkness in this community and it's all rooted on these myths that, why do you think it's so hard to dispel these like clear and obvious myths for this group of like angry, frustrated men?
Well, I think that there are some people who want to be angry and stay frustrated. Can't really help them much. And I think there are people who don't recognize the humanity of other people. So, if everybody who you're interested in, you care about, is a young person, let's say that everybody you care about in this world is between age 18 and 30. It's all your friends, all the people you socialize with all the time, and they're all able-bodied and they're all white, then you forget that other humans exist and you might not even think of them as human. And it's the same with class. Like sometimes middle class and richer people believe that everyone has enough money in their wallet to go shopping to solve a problem, that you can solve a problem with money. Not everybody can, but people with money forget that. So I think it's just people just get insular. They only talk to people who are like themselves. And if you're a guy who's afraid of women because you're shy about dating, maybe you're going to find all male environments to hang out in, online or offline. And then you'll forget that women are people because you are interacting only with men. And the only people who have personalities in your world are men, and everybody else is just some sort of abstract picture. So I think it could be very easy for a man to forget that women are people. And I think we should think about porn. Pornography often, it shows bodies rather than whole personalities, and it's mostly the women's bodies who are shown, and it does put people as objects on the screen. So I think that if a man's only interaction with women is in the abstract, he sees pictures online or he sees porn, or he only sees one or two women in his life, maybe your mom or somebody, then you're going to forget that other women are people. The more insular you get, the more you forget about humanity.
that also touches on another societal risk that we have, which I've kind of been thinking about this lately, and I've probably been guilty of it myself as well, is the fact that the male white incel, or not all white, but definitely the male incel community has been getting so much attention because of the violence and because of the, the nature of the online community. Not just the news, but also like memes. If you've seen like internet culture, there's a lot of memes about incels now. And I wonder if there's a problem that might create the problem of erasing other communities like trans, disabled women that are facing these problems, because so much of the attention is being focused on the men who are having this problem now. Is that something you see as a potential problem?
It's focused on the straight guys. And so the Love Not Anger project that I'm doing is about all genders, all orientations, and any people who have this issue, and for that exact reason. And I want us to start looking more at, what kind of difficulties with dating do queer people have? If you are lesbian or gay or bisexual, dating is more confusing. The rules are not clear. You have fewer people available to you to date. If you're in a homophobic community, it might be dangerous. So, yeah, we need to be looking at, all sorts of different communities, not just at the straight guys.
And that's where my kind of hypothesis comes in for how to solve these problems, which is I think that community is the key, and that building a community like you're trying to build, where you have a lot of different people from different backgrounds coming together and sharing their experiences, could be so helpful. Because for one thing, it dispels these myths that, only my group, and it might not just be men who feel that way. Maybe, I'm conjecturing here, but maybe if you're a disabled person, you feel like, oh, it's because I'm disabled and I have these problems. But maybe meeting other people who have different backgrounds than you can show you that, there are a lot of different paths that can bring you to these same problems. And then that can sort of open your mind to the fact that maybe there are different paths to escape it as well. Is that sort of something that you're hoping will happen, or am I phrasing that properly? Or
that's really neat. I think you're helping me with this collaboration actually right now, because I hadn't thought that far. And just to explain, I haven't started a support community. I've started a collaboration community online, where I've got a small group of people like yourself who have voluntarily joined to share personal experiences, but also research work and development work to come up with approaches to this issue. And yeah, if we have people from different backgrounds and different reasons for their own different experiences of loneliness, that's really valuable. It's like it's a diversity of perspectives that we need. So yes, to develop supports that are really helpful to people, we need to have some answers for the straight guys who are confused about why they're not getting the privileges they're due. We need to have answers for the straight women who are confused about what the rules are for dating. We need to have answers for people in queer or other marginalized communities where the rules are different, the expectations are different, and the constraints are tougher. And so all these people have different experiences.
Oh yeah, for sure. And I think about when I was a teenager going through these experiences, being in school, we would have people come in and talk about drugs, and we would have people come in and we would have sex education. We would talk about, all these problems, but we never had somebody come in to talk about the problems that I was facing, because I never did drugs, and I was a pretty good student. I didn't have so every time someone came in that was like a guidance counselor talking about some of these issues, they were not issues that affected me. But I think about if a counselor came in and said, hey, if you really feel lonely and you're having trouble dating and you're having these problems, just having those kinds of resources would have been so helpful to me when I was going through that dark period in my life. So what is that sort of, I guess I'm wondering, like, what do you see this organization developing into? What kind of, I guess, deliverables do you think that do you see that might be coming out of this?
That's a great question. It's pretty early. Definitely, I would like to see some resources for educators and counselors. So what kind of things do you do in the school to help people understand their relationships and dating? You were lucky enough to get sex education, which sometimes includes like 15 minutes of talking about relationships, like my grade 10 class did. Yeah, there's an opportunity in schools. There's opportunity in other places where youth go for leadership, like the the Girl and Boy Scouts or the Boys and Girls Club or whatever other youth activities. And there's opportunity in the counseling space. So the deliverables of Love Not Anger project, tentatively, I've got a research agenda. I would like to engage some academic researchers from psychology and other social science disciplines to get some evidence about what are the causes of dating difficulties. And if we know the causes, we can come up with better solutions. So building those support resources, which might be something direct, like an online forum, but are more likely indirect things like, here's some curriculum for educators to lead people through it. So what I'm hoping is like there'll be more spin-off efforts. So if you think about anti-bullying, I think that might be a similar kind of campaign. When I was young, there was no effort in schools about bullying. It was just a thing the principal dealt with. And later on, there was tremendous awareness and efforts taken. There are lots and lots of organizations that are trying to do something about bullying. It might be just on the awareness level, but they're trying to do something. So a successful movement that goes society-wide generally has a lot of spin-offs. So this Love Not Anger project is not going to solve all the world's problems. It's not going to do everything. It's basically to prompt many other people to do something. And so I'm gradually talking to charities, I'm talking to academic researchers, and I'll be talking more to the public to get movement happening. And if someone else is inspired to do something about lonely people who have dating difficulties, then absolutely, let's all go and do something.
Yeah, it sounds almost like a think tank.
Yeah, it's a little. Yeah, I'm kind of a thinker. I'm a bit of an academic, so it's going to come on. It's a little bit research and think tank-ish, but right now it's a very informal project. It's not an official organization yet, so I'm working on that. But looking for some partnerships too.
If somebody is listening to this and they want to get involved, what can they do?
So if you go to lovenotanger.org, that's all one word, Love Not Anger, that you'll see a page called Collaboration, and if you have something to contribute, to skills to offer, you're welcome to send me a message and ask to join the forum. We're discussing really basic things like what's a good name for a person who has dating difficulties. Because the name incel is taken. It's not a good name anymore.
I was going to ask this earlier. Do you ever feel like I tried to put myself in your shoes when I was like reading your stories and listening to your podcast. Do you ever feel like maybe you created a monster, or how do you feel about the way that this is?
I went through that feeling, absolutely. I know that what I created 20 years ago was a good thing, and it helped a lot of people. And it morphed, it changed, it ran away, and words do that, especially a word that is naming something that's negative in a society. You start off with a positive euphemism, like, for example, handicapped used to be a polite word, and then it became a rude word because it was describing something negative. Yeah, so incel, it became a negative word. And so now we're looking for another word that is not just about lack of sex, but more about difficulty finding love and intimacy. So the meaning, the little shift there.
And you might have some listeners now that are, maybe they identify as incel or they're facing these problems. What would you say to them if you could just talk to them directly?
So if you mean a guy who was like participating in the incel forums?
Yeah, I mean, well, I guess maybe go beyond the community they're in, but just, somebody who's struggling with these problems. Because maybe it's a guy that's an incel, maybe it's a person from another, that has other problems. Maybe it's a woman, but what would you just because you went through it yourself?
I think,
I'm just curious, what would you say?
I did, and I think I would say different things to different people. Well, first of all, to everybody who is struggling with loneliness, I would suggest, like I said, there is some hope. It's important to make human connections. It's important to take it slow. There's no easy, simple solution. You can't, take a pill to solve this problem of whatever color. This is not the microwave. This is like the slow cooker, not the microwave of relationships. It's going to take a while, And it requires some courage, taking a few risks to go and talk to other humans and get to know people. Because the more people you get to know, the more likely you are to find someone who really likes you and who wants to spend more time with you. And, if people can take a relaxed approach to that, it will help. The other thing I would say is to get help. Do get support. And that means probably getting counseling or therapy from someone who can help you understand why you might have ended up in this situation of being lonely. Someone who will tell you the truth. That, the truth might be that the size of your nose is just fine. Or the truth might be that really your personal hygiene needs to improve. Or the truth might be that you're a wonderful person who's a bit shy and needs to learn some techniques for interacting with other people. There could be a lot of truths, and speaking to someone who will be honest with you about it and with whom you can be safely vulnerable in a confidential space is really valuable. I got a lot of value from speaking to a therapist, both way back when and recently, and I do recommend it for everybody. Make an effort to find some counseling, to talk to somebody about your difficulties with dating, and listen to sensible advice about taking a slow and careful path towards making human connections. If someone offers you an instant fix that, it's the microwave of relationships, they're probably trying to scam you, and they're giving you too easy an answer. It's hard. It takes a lot of courage to make a change in your life.
Well, as a fellow human being who has struggled with these kinds of issues, I just want to say it's very obvious to me that you're putting your heart and your mind into this work. And I'd like to thank you for taking this initiative and putting together this project. So I think it's important work. Just thank you for caring. So is there anything else that you wanted to add or anything else that we didn't bring up that you wanted to talk about?
Thank you for wanting to hear about the future of this situation. I think the Love Not Anger project is just a prompt to the world to say, let's look towards the future. Let's not just get angry about a few people who were violent. Let's focus on everybody of all genders who is having difficulty with social skills and dating. And let's have some empathy for each other so we can build respectful relationships.
I think that's a great message to end on. Thank you so much for coming on the program. And again, your website is lovenotanger.org.
Yes, thank you.